Let's answer a question that has likely kept absolutely none of you awake at night, mostly because it is the stuff of specific fever dream nightmares. The question is this: what would happen if every single mosquito on planet Earth decided to feed on the same person at the exact same time? The immediate, visceral answer is that our test subject, let's call him Steve, would look up at the sky, see a black cloud descending, look mildly annoyed, and then instantly collapse into a dried, husk-like raisin. A little human prune. But that is the boring answer. That is the answer for people who don't understand the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the numbers we are dealing with. The real answer involves thermodynamics, acoustic liquefaction, and a pile of biomass so large it would technically qualify as a geographical feature. So let's ruin Steve's day for science. First, we need to take a census. It is notoriously difficult to count mosquitoes because they are small, they move around, and generally people are too busy swatting them to take notes. However, entomologists, people who like bugs way too much, estimate the global population of mosquitoes is roughly 110 trillion. That is a 1 followed by 14 zeros. To put that into perspective, if you stacked a 110 trillion mosquitoes on top of each other, you wouldn't just reach the moon, you would create a column of biomass that extends past Mars. But we aren't stacking them. We are targeting them. The first hurdle for our apocalypse scenario is logistics. Steve is an average human male. He has a surface area of about 1.9 square meters. A mosquito has a footprint of roughly a few square millimeters. If the mosquitoes are polite and land on his skin in a single layer to feed, we can fit about 200,000 of them on Steve at once. This is a problem. We have under 10 trillion volunteers and only 200,000 seats. If they take turns and each feeding session lasts about 2 minutes, the line to bite Steve would take just over 2,000 years to clear. Steve would die of old age, or more likely extreme boredom, long before the last mosquito got a drink. This violates the premise of at the exact same time, so we have to cheat. We have to ignore personal space. To get 110 trillion mosquitoes to feed on Steve simultaneously, they cannot form a layer. They must form a cloud, a swarm, a sphere of death if you will. Let's look at the mass. An average mosquito weighs about 2.5 milligrams. 110 trillion of them weighs roughly 2,075,000 metric tons. For comparison, that is not a swarm of bugs. That is the weight of 2.5 Nimitz-class nuclear aircraft carriers. We are effectively dropping a fleet of Navy vessels made entirely of chitin and malice directly onto Steve's head. This brings us to the first way Steve dies, long before a single drop of blood is spilled. The sound mosquitoes beat their wings anywhere from 450 to 600 times per second. That creates the high-pitched whine that ruins your camping trips. A single mosquito produces about 20 decibels of sound from a meter away, which is negligible. However, sound pressure adds up logarithmically. If we compress 110 trillion mosquitoes into a tight sphere around Steve, let's say a sphere about 500 meters wide, which is as tight as we can pack them without them crushing each other, the acoustic energy becomes a weapon. As the cloud descends, the sound wouldn't just be loud, it would be a physical wall. The volume would rapidly exceed 190 decibels. For reference, the Saturn V rocket launch was roughly 204 decibels, and that sound was loud enough to melt concrete and ignite grass purely through sound waves. At this volume, the air itself begins to compress and heat up due to the sheer intensity of the pressure waves. Inside the center of the swarm, the buzzing ceases to be a sound you hear and becomes a shockwave you feel. Steve's eardrums rupture instantly. Shortly after, his internal organs turn to jelly from the acoustic vibration. He is essentially vibrated into a soup before he can even register the itch. But let's say Steve is wearing really good noise-canceling headphones. He survives the sound. Now he has to deal with the heat. This is where thermodynamics ruins everything. Every living thing generates heat as a byproduct of metabolism. Flying is hard work. A mosquito generates a tiny amount of heat, but again, we are multiplying by 110 trillion. If you pack this much biomass into a dense sphere, the heat has nowhere to go. The outer layers of mosquitoes insulate the inner layers. The center of the swarm where Steve is standing becomes a thermal runaway reaction. This is the same physics that happens inside a compost pile, which can spontaneously catch fire, but accelerated by millions of tiny frantic wings. Calculations suggest that the core temperature of this mosquito ball would skyrocket within minutes. The air temperature around Steve would surpass 100 degrees Celsius very quickly, then 200. The mosquitoes closest to Steve would literally cook, dying of heat stroke and falling like a rain of crispy biological confetti. But their dead bodies would trap the heat even more effectively. The temperature would continue to climb until the organic matter begins to combust. Steve doesn't get bitten, he gets baked in a crust of incinerated insects. But we are here for the premise. We want the blood. So let's deploy our physics be damned force field. Steve is now immune to sound, heat, and the crushing weight of 2 aircraft carriers of bugs. He stands there, stoic, ready to donate. The 110 trillion mosquitoes insert their proboscises. Since there isn't enough skin for everyone, we have to assume they are phasing through one another, ghost style, to reach his veins. They all begin to suck at the exact same moment. Here is the math of the fluid dynamics. An average human has about 5 liters of blood. There are 110 trillion mosquitoes. This means each mosquito gets about 4.5 times 10 to the negative 14 liters of blood. That is not much. In fact, that is less than the volume of a single red blood cell. Most of the mosquitoes would get absolutely nothing. They would suck, and the vacuum pressure would collapse the universe's most disappointing juice box. However, let's look at the flow rate. A mosquito usually drinks its fill in roughly 90 seconds. They are designed to draw blood gently, so the host doesn't notice. But we have 110 trillion pumps attached to a closed system. When they activate, the pressure inside Steve's circulatory system drops to a perfect vacuum instantly. But it's worse than that. They aren't just pulling on the blood, they are pulling on the space the blood occupies. The suction force of 110 trillion mosquitoes trying to pull 5 liters of fluid through a surface area of 1.9 square meters would result in a pressure differential that the human body is not designed to handle. In the blink of an eye, Steve is not drained, he is imploded. The mechanical stress of that many points of suction would essentially turn his skin, muscles, and bones into a fine mist. He wouldn't turn into a raisin, he would be vaporized into a red aerosol cloud. He would be vacuumed out of existence, dispersed into the stomachs of the first billion lucky mosquitoes. The remaining 109.9 trillion mosquitoes would be very confused, having sucked up nothing but a bit of Steve-flavored air. So, we have a situation where our subject has been liquefied by sound, cooked by metabolic heat, crushed by biomass, and finally vacuum vaporized. But what happens next? This is where the story goes from personal tragedy to global environmental disaster. We have gathered 2,705,000 tons of biomass in one location. In the real world, mosquitoes are spread out, serving as food for birds and frogs. By teleporting them all to Steve's backyard, we have just collapsed the food webs of every ecosystem on Earth. The Arctic tundra loses its pollinators. The tropical rainforests lose a major food source. Fish populations crash, birds starve. It's an ecological nightmare. Meanwhile, back at Steve's house, the swarm begins to disperse. They are hungry, they are agitated, and they are covered in the ash of their fallen comrades. 110 trillion mosquitoes spreading out from a single point would look like a nuclear explosion composed entirely of pests. This blast wave of bugs would travel outward, stripping the land of anything with a pulse. Cows, dogs, deer, neighbors, nothing is safe. The density of the cloud would be so high that it would darken the sky across an entire hemisphere. It would be a plague of biblical proportions, except the Bible usually stopped at locusts and frogs, presumably because the writers thought a mosquito cloud was too depressing to write down. The carbon footprint of this event would also be spectacular, as the mosquitoes eventually die off because they can't find enough food after eating Steve and his neighbors. Their decomposing bodies would release a massive pulse of methane and carbon dioxide. We are talking about a pile of rotting insects large enough to bury Manhattan up to the shin. The smell alone would likely trigger a secondary mass extinction event of anyone with a functioning nose. So, to summarize our findings, if every mosquito on Earth tried to suck blood from the same person at the same time, the blood loss would be the least of that person's problems. The victim would be crushed, deafened, cooked, and vaporized, likely all within the first few seconds. The resulting ecological vacuum would crash global food chains, and the dispersal of the survivors would create a hemisphere-spanning cloud of death that would make the black look like a mild case of the sniffles. The universe, in its infinite wisdom, spread these little monsters out for a reason. Physics does not like it when you put all the bugs in one basket. But on the bright side, for one glorious, fleeting microsecond, Steve was the most popular guy on Earth. And really, isn't that what we all want? Thanks for watching, and sweet dreams.